Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, made very influential criticisms of mercantilism. He rejected the idea that a country's wealth consisted of its accumulated gold. Instead, he said, it is the produce of a country's land and labor that could be properly considered national wealth. By produce of land and labor, he meant what we understand today as the country's total output or GDP. So his criterion in judging the policies inspired by mercantilism was whether it increased a country's output or not. And he argued that they did not. First, protecting domestic manufacturers from foreign competition gave them monopoly of domestic markets, enabling them to charge higher prices and shielding them from the consequences of their laziness and mismanagement. Surely, this was not conducive to maximizing output. Even if the protected industries were booming, he cautioned against concluding that the total output of the economy was expanding. After all, the total resources in an economy are fixed and scarce. The resources going into the protected industries had to come from somewhere, thus making it more difficult for the non-protected industries to maintain their production levels or expand. To use a modern economics term, Adam Smith was simply pointing out that resources have opportunity costs. In fact, it was likely that the total production of the economy was falling. How so? The emphasis on trade surplus was causing countries to view its trading partners as rivals, because one country's net gold inflow is another country's net gold outflow. Thus, countries were imposing tariffs and counter-tariffs and counter-counter tariffs, greatly diminishing the flow of goods. This was unfortunate, Smith said, because the real benefits of trade arise not from gold inflows, but specialization. Specialization was Adam Smith's big thing. In his Wealth of Nations, he marveled quite at length about what he called the division of labor. Using a pin factory as an example, he described how total production and total wealth would rise as a result of specialization. International trade, he said, encouraged greater specialization because it increased the pool of people you could trade with. As he put it in a famous sentence, division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. And because specialization was something that benefited both countries simultaneously, the true nature of international trade was not that of rivalry, but mutual benefit. Advocates of free trade today are using the same argument when they say that restricting Americans, for example, from trading with the Chinese is as absurd as restricting New Yorkers from trading with the Californians. If trading with the Californians is mutually beneficial, something that few people doubt, why is it harmful to trade with the Chinese? Adam Smith also did not like tariffs because they interfered with the price system, which, as he famously pointed out at length, guided resources to their most valued use. As a result of such flow, the economy's production as a whole was maximized. When governments interfere and artificially increase the prices of certain goods by imposing tariffs, more resources than otherwise end up flowing to the protected sector from other sectors where they are more likely to have been valued more. Such interference is not conducive to the goal of maximizing a country's output. Smith asked who exactly benefited from mercantilism. The producers and merchants of the protected goods, of course. It is they who, after all, end up with the gold that flows into the country. But it harmed the consumers who make up the vast majority because they pay increased prices and have to make do with fewer goods. Smith condemned any policy that encouraged production but reduced consumption. Consumption is, after all, he maintained, the ultimate goal of all economic activity. We produce more so that we can consume more. Mercantilism's focus on increasing trade surplus not only reduced the economy's total production, but it reduced the country's consumption even more. How so? Because imports are what we consume, while exports are what we produce but the foreigners consume. Notice that when Britain ran a trade surplus, as in our previous example, it ended up with a net inflow of gold. But it was the rest of the world that ended up with a net inflow of goods. If we recognize that it is consumption that we ultimately care about, who is the real winner in this whole exercise? Critics of mercantilism today are making the same point when they ask, if exports are so good and imports so bad, how about we export 100% of what we produce, down to every single grain, and import nothing? Just think how much gold we would end up with. By taking the mercantilist idea to such extreme, they intend to show how fallacious it is. In sum, we can say that Smith opposed mercantilism because it reduced the scope of specialization, interfered with the price system that directed resources to their most valuable uses, and reduced the country's total consumption.